Welcome everyone to today's conversations organized by TISS-Hyd School of Education. Today's discussion is about transgender, gender non-conforming and non-binary persons in the Indian science ecosystem. For today's discussion, we have Sayantan Datta, a queer trans science journalist, writer and communicator. Sayantan Datta writes at the intersections of science, gender, sexuality, caste and health. Their book chapter, Finding Homosexuality in the Genome, a critique of genetic investigations on sexuality, has been published in Sexuality, Abjection, and Queer Existence in Contemporary India. Currently, Sayantan is a faculty member at the Center for Writing and Pedagogy at Kriya University. So, without delaying the discussion further, I request Sayantan to start the discussion.
Thanks, Ritvik, for the very kind introduction, and to Anu for the extremely grateful. I'm very grateful to you, Anu, for extending this invitation, and to Rekha for this engagement with the kind of work that I do at Kriya. I'm going to present my screen. I'd request somebody to give me a heads up if you're able to see my presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Sayantan. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to start by thinking about, what is it that a lot of this work is geared towards. This is some of my work that has been happening since the last 2.5 years or so. And we are writing this up, so I thought this would be something good to present and also get some feedback while initiating conversations, as the program is called. So fundamentally, what I'm interested in is the question of identity formation and consolidation, especially in science and science institutions. And if one were to think about how identity has been theorized and spoken about in science and science institutions, then people speak about what is called a science identity, right? So what is the identity that helps somebody, become a scientist? How do you say I'm a scientist? And in 2007, two ethnographers, Carlone and Johnson, did a ethnographic study with 15 women of color in the United States, and they gave this model of science identity, right, which had 3 categories which intersected together, and at this intersection, a science identity sort of coalesced. The 3 categories were competence, performance, and recognition. And what competence meant was somebody's ability to do science. Performance was how do they do science, and recognition means how others recognize them as a scientist. And of course, the recognition bit is important because identity, by its very definition, is something that's social and is built in constant interaction with not just yourself, but others. So this was the traditional model of science identity that was given by Carlone and Johnson in 2007, including 3 large aspects which had competence, recognition, and performance. Remember that while this was data that was gotten from women of colors, scientists, but these were the entire data that Carlone and Johnson were working with were women of color who had quote unquote made it in the science ecosystem in the United States. And when I first encountered this model as somebody who's interested in identity formation and consolidation as a broad question, I was quite intrigued because this model had several conundrums, right? So for example, one is that how does one make a distinction between their science identity and the several other social identities that they occupy? It's given that science itself is a social act, then perhaps science identity is one of the several social identities that somebody possesses. But more importantly, I was also curious to understand whether the in-group, out-group boundary, the boundary that distinguishes science identity from social identity, is as sharp as we believe it is. If you know a little bit about Bruno Latour's theorization on modernity, then we know that it is this thrust of modernity that asks us to distinguish all our identities from pre-existing identities. So then science identity as something that's happening in the context of modern science would be this identity that would sort of constantly demand distinction from all social identities. And I was trying to understand whether this distinction holds true or not, how sharp this border of in-group, out-group border is. So then when one also looks at the three categories that are used to build science and identity, especially in Calhoun and Johnson's model, then we identify that performance, competence, and recognition are murky waters to treat, especially in the Indian science ecosystem where gender, caste, class, sexuality, and ability, disability, have made the idea of performance, competition, and recognition extremely complex. So for example, if one were to look at the aggregate, the data of the number of women scientists versus the number of male scientists in Indian science institutions, then we see that biology has the highest percentage of women scientists as compared to male scientists. And the number as of today is about 24%, which is extremely less. It's less than 70, so which means more than 75% of all biologists in this country, which is the science which has the sort of the relatively better gender distribution. Even there, the number is less than 25%. And as you sort of go towards the quote unquote masculine disciplines, what feminist science studies scholars have called masculine disciplines like physics, chemistry, and engineering, this number just drops consistently. And we have extremely good data that tells us that this is not because women scientists don't perform as well or are not as competent as their male colleagues, but because of systemic and structural inequalities that exclude women from the pursuit of science. And then there are intersectional realities that one has to look at. For example, in 2010, I think Anita Kurup, Rohini Godbole, and others looked at what is the caste distribution of women in research. So women scientists who had made it, what was the caste distribution of those researchers? And they found that more than 80% of these researchers, women in research, came from general caste, upper caste backgrounds, while only 5.4% came from OBC backgrounds, 1.9% from scheduled caste backgrounds, and there was only one person in a pool of almost 300 respondents to their survey who came from the scheduled tribe background. So not only gender, but also caste complicates the idea of performance, competence, and recognition, and how these three work to build science identity. And I do have some more things to talk about performance, competence, and recognitions. For example, when one looks at okay, is somebody saying something? Sorry.
No, Simon, go ahead. It is
no worries. Okay, so we're still talking about performance, competence, and recognition, right? So in 2007, we had a study which showed that queer undergrad students in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics were 8% less likely than their straight and cisgender peers to remain in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics, even when people sort of controlled for the various characteristics that determined retention. And so this again raises, so this meant that these are not students who are unable to perform or are not competent, but are sort of eliminated from the system as a result of systemic and structural inequalities, which would include, bullying, harassment, ostracization, etc. Rennie Thomas's very intriguing ethnography of Indian science institutions, and ethnography of Indian science institutions also tells us how the very idea of performance, competence, and recognition is entrenched in the question of merit, and how the question of merit is entrenched in a question of caste. So for example, I have quoted from Thomas's book here, where what you see is the idea that many Brahmin scientists believe that there's an inherent and intrinsic ability of Brahmins to be scientists and passionate and curious. And in fact, Thomas's paper is called Brahmins as Scientists and Science as Brahmins Calling. So for example, this is one of Rennie Thomas's respondents who's saying that these guys, and by these guys, the person's talking about SC/ST candidates in the Indian Institute of Science, which is, it's a bastion of Brahminism. The person's saying, these guys are not interested to waste time like us. They think it is better to go for a technical or business education so that they would get immediate benefit. Science and research will not have an immediate effect. It takes time to get benefits. The most important thing one ought to have while pursuing research is patience, which we don't find among these groups. So we see that the idea of performance and competence is very complicated, and it looks like performance and competence are not embedded in the person who's seeking a science identity, but within a system and within a structure within which science works. And oftentimes, these categories of performance, competence, and recognition act to marginalize people from already marginalized groups. In fact, even recognition, for example, a very interesting example would be, so Sugra Chunawala and Savita Ladake, who I think Sugra has just retired from the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, Bombay, and Savita is perhaps still the dean there. So when both of them, what they did is they administered the Draw a Scientist test. The Draw a Scientist test is very interesting. You go to educational institutions, schools particularly, you give children pieces of paper, white paper, and a pen or a pencil or something, and say, draw a scientist. And then you analyze these images, not for how well they are drawn, but for what are the common motives that repeat in their imagination of scientists. And from there, you can talk about how the scientist is recognized in school children. And we see that from Sugra and Savita's data that 86.5% students, including a mix of boys and girls, drew male appearing scientists, while only 4% boys drew female appearing scientists. Of course, 10% girls, a little more than boys, drew female appearing scientists. And we also realized, Sugra and Savita also realized that younger students, so the younger you administer the test to, there's a higher possibility of getting more female scientists from students' drawings. So it looks like as students grow up in a science curriculum, they constantly are the gendered notion, the gendered image of a scientist, where the scientist is a stereotypical, eccentric, male, often Brahmin person. That image is entrenched in their minds deeper and deeper as they progress in educational institutions. So having questioned the categories of performance, competence, and recognition, and also having thought about how science identity and social identities are not as distinct from each other as Carlone and Johnson had claimed, I was also trying to understand whether some of these identities can be co-constructed. So whether the science identity and the social identity can be co-constructed. And I think what I'm going to read out now is the abstract of Chainika Shah's 2017 article called Chronicles of a Queer Relationship with Science. It was published in the Economic and Political Weekly Feminist Science Studies special issue, which was edited by Asha Achyutan and Geeta Chadha. So I'm just going to read that bit out, and we can think together about the kind of reciprocal relationship that exists between one's identity in the sciences and one's identity outside the sciences in social movements. So for example, so Chainika says, this article traverses a journey of a person in science and feminism, highlighting a trajectory in which her relationship with science, its praxis, and its understanding all transformed as her engagement with feminisms also evolved. The narrative highlights the change from a narrow understanding of science and a career within it to the emerging multiple possibilities of being a person in science. A change made possible because the feminist lens shifts focus from the question of women in science to a feminist understanding of science. The process hence results in a slow inhabiting of the outsider in a reimagined landscape of the discipline. So now I found this a beautiful way of sort of articulating what I had been thinking about for some time, which is this critique of science that some of us had as science as exclusionary, science as rabbinical, science as patriarchal, science as homophobic, science as transphobic, science as serving the interests of the military, science as serving, through the axes of biopower. The purpose of this critique is not to say science has no benefits, right? So I mean, I must clarify at the outset that none of us who work with critiques of science are anti-science. We are really looking at how one can reimagine science as a discipline, change its landscape in a way that science becomes a tool for social justice, a dream that the people science movement thought about even in the late 1970s. Um, but what we're also, this narrative is also interesting for me because it tells us that identities of people in the sciences and outside the sciences are not evolved separately over the course of time. And there's an intersectional reciprocal relationship between the kind of work somebody does in the sciences and the kind of work that they do outside the sciences. And this kind of intersectionality actually transforms their work in both the spheres. So for example, Chainika, as a scientist, participated in the women's health movement in the post-emergency India and continued to work in it for about 2 decades, raising several questions on state suppression and oppression of women's bodies, and questions on similar lines. And at the same time was talking about a feminist understanding of science, where you can both critique and transform science at the same time. And that's the location that I wanted to contextualize my work in, as somebody who is interested in understanding how identity is constructed and consolidated, particularly in the science ecosystem. So the question that I started out with, this was in 2020, is how do transgender, gender non-conforming, and gender non-binary persons, which would be some of the most gender marginal groups in the Indian science ecosystem, form, consolidate, and negotiate their various identities, which could be identities as physicists, identities as chemists and mathematicians, engineers, but also as identities like people who are transgender, people who are gender non-conforming, and people who are gender non-binary. And for me, this question was very important because as transgender people, we often have an identity that is located within a larger marginalized community. So let's say a larger community of transgender people in the same city. And that location is as important to me, as is my location as, let's say, a scientist in an institute. But these two identities, especially the science identity, if it was always claiming a certain distinction from all my other identities, then how does one negotiate this bifurcation, this cleft habitus that somebody who's transgender and in the science ecosystem would be looking at? So I was sort of interested in understanding this negotiation, and that's the question that I sort of started with. The field for my research was primarily, for most of my work, was Science Education and Research Institute. And in fact, it might be sort of being overcautious to say that there are science education and research institutions, because at least in the context of India, science education institutes are also research institutions, and science research institutions are also educational institutions. But the reason why I wanted to go to these institutions to study the question of identity formation in the sciences was because of the 4 reasons that I've mentioned on the screen. I'll also take you through them slowly. So one is that that science is a discipline that's extremely dependent on categorization, and this categorization in sciences is very strict and uncritical, which leads to construction of social identities as scientific truths. An example, I mean, a way of thinking about that would be to think about how, for a long time, neuroscience researchers looked for, sex in the brain. So they kept on saying that, okay, females have this part of the brain small, or this part of the brain large, or this is the kind of oxygen consumption that differs, etc., etc., etc. All of this without testing, without whether the categories of male and female are valid categories. Right. I mean, before you find correlates of categories, you're supposed to test whether categories are real. But that's not the kind of work that sciences would often be engaged in. And that's exactly the kind of work that social sciences would want to do. I mean, a lot of qualitative research is geared at producing categories that are more meaningful than what we assume are natural categories. So then construction of social identities become sort of social identities then are sort of transcribed as scientific truths through the process of strict and uncritical categorization in science. We have seen this not just in the case of cisgender women, but also for queer and trans people. There are thousands and thousands of papers which have either tried to find a gay gene, a gay brain, I mean, a gay blood, etc. I mean, there's really no end to this kind of construction that we're talking about. But what was also important for me is that people often come to educational institutions, including science institutions, at a time when they are forming and consolidating their identities. So they are exploring themselves and they are forming identities. So for example, I'm a 17 or 18-year-old who walks into a place like the Indian Institute of Science in a tier 1 city like Bangalore, which has sort of a history of queer and trans mobilization, has a certain nightlife and a certain kind of access that tier 1 urban spaces give you. This is the space where a 17-year-old is consolidating their gender and sexuality identities. So I was also interested in the field of educational institutions, science educational institutions, because of the kind of population that it attracts or hopes to attract. And then there was a larger question of queering science and science education. So for example, it's a very recent discourse about queering science education because queering education itself is such a recent discussion that, I mean, there's a growing consensus among queer theorists that queering science education can lead to what they call a new science, one that problematizes strict deductive principles and institutions rather than problematizing marginalized communities, which is the kind of work that science has primarily done, right? So it's either said that brains of gay men are, have parts which are smaller than males of heterosexual men. Or for example, this year's medicine Nobel laureate Svante Pavo, he's done a body of work using the Neanderthal genome, and he has said that, okay, Indians are more susceptible to COVID-19 because they have more Neanderthal genome in them than white people. So extremely racist work, extremely sexist and patriarchal work. And that has been the approach of science. It has problematized marginalized communities rather than problematizing institutions of racism, patriarchy, sexism, militarism that enable this kind of discourse to perpetuate. And people who are interested in queering science education have to think about how to reimagine science in a way that this lens is sort of turned back on science itself. And that's what I've been trying to say, that queering science then can challenge the nexus between state, science, medicine, and civil society, right? So science is a tool of the state and science is a tool of the civil society. And the three of them are in a nexus that create marginalized gender and sexual identities. So they constantly construct this marginalization and this marginalization, this construction of marginalization can be challenged by the act of queering science. While queering science will also provide us new ways of kinship and community building. And we must remember that kinship and community building is a it's a question in science that, as far as we don't recognize it, but has guided a lot of science since a very long time, be it the discourse on evolutionary biology, be it the discourse on reproductive biology. The question of kinship and community building is as fundamental to sciences, as fundamental it is to social sciences like sociology. The method then that I was thinking about, and I have ended up using, are autobiographical narratives from transgender, gender non-conforming, and gender non-binary persons in the Indian science ecosystem. The reasons are relatively simpler. That stories and histories, so histories and stories of transgender non-conforming and gender non-binary persons in science are underrepresented. At this point of time, I was already doing some work with the lifeofscience.com, which is a feminist multimedia science collective. I was making comic strips of transgender, non-conforming, and gender non-binary people in the Indian science ecosystem and their journeys. So I realized the severe lack of stories and histories of trans, GNC, and GNP people in Indian science. But also I was interested in collecting autobiographical narratives. Partly that was a journalistic interest. It was a method that was familiar to me, but also because autobiographical narratives of people in science are not just a way for us to understand the lives of science practitioners, but the discipline itself. So I believe that if I had access to autobiographical narratives that had not come out in the public before, this would not just help me understand who these people are, but what the discipline is. And as Asha Chutan and Geeta Chadha wrote in 2017, Introduction to the Feminist Science Studies volume, autobiographical narratives offer an account of enmeshed experience of inclusion alongside marginalization and discrimination. And that is important for us to think about, is because many of these trans, GNC, and GNP people have quote unquote made it in the Indian science ecosystem. So it's important for us to understand this inclusion, access of inclusion, alongside the axis of marginalization and discrimination. And at least Achutan and Chadha have before used paired autobiographical narratives as a tool to sort of elicit this kind of an account. Of course, I was not working with paired autobiographical narratives, but autobiographical narratives themselves can sort of give us these enmeshed experience that Achutan and Chadha talk about. So what I'm now going to present is some data over the last 2 years that I've been able to compile. And remember that we had started with the categories that were extremely problematic and meritocratic, right? So we had categories of performance, competence, and recognition, which we realized were casteist, patriarchal, and sexist, and were sort of embedded in systemic and structural inequalities and had the potential to perpetuate systemic and structural inequalities. So as a part of my work, I was thinking about, can these autobiographical narratives from people who are in gender marginal locations, so transgender, gender non-conforming, and gender non-binary persons, can these narratives give us other ways, other stories, other trajectories through which we can understand identity construction of people in the sciences? So I have 6 such registers, and while they are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, I must say that these are not registers that either are linear. So that doesn't mean register 2 comes after register 1 necessarily, nor are they as distinct from each other as we want to imagine them to be. This is just for the sake of the presentation that one has had to draw some distinctions. But let's see, and I'm happy to hear more from you if these 6 registers make sense. So the first register that I speak about is called coming. This is from the part of the qualitative interviews where I was thinking about what brings people to the sciences, right? Why do queer trans people, gender non-conforming people take up sciences, especially when they are in class 10 or they're class 12? So one of my respondents, we'll call them Morpheus. Morpheus says, I remember that there was this article on gravity that was trying to describe how gravity can be thought about as this stretched rubber sheet. It introduced us to the ideas of space-time using this analogy. It tried to position what Marx is as distortions on the sheet. This was fascinating. I can think about the entire universe in this way. So the idea of physics as a way of exploring the universe, as a way of understanding better what our physical world is, that was just astounding. Some of it was really fascinating. So a part of coming, where the science identity construction begins, which is when somebody comes to the science ecosystem, and a part of that is really entrenched and embedded in this vision of fascination and curiosity that sciences have spoken about for a long time. But then very soon from the same narratives, we also understand that there are other aspects of identity and identity construction that become important in terms of coming to science. So for example, Morpheus said, if you are a good student, you're supposed to be a science student. So there's a mobility and social capital that's associated with being a science student. And this social capital is extremely difficult to shed off. But for queer and trans people, I think this is also interesting, and I'm hoping to carry this work forward, which is the question of migration, right? So many of these are 17, 18-year-old young queer and trans people who are migrating from different places in the country to tier one cities, tier one institutions in tier one cities, where they do not have sort of the towering and helicopter presence of their parents. So what happens is that then science institutions also become a space where of exploration and upliftment that one has been thinking about. So for example, Salah, another of my respondents, says that since I was living far from home, I didn't have to pretend to be cisgender in any way. So or Nix, who's an undergraduate student in the same institution, says that I was finally able to get away from my birth family and get away from Bhopal when I came to Bangalore. In Bhopal, I was not aware of the existence of queer groups because I was living with my parents and I was not allowed to go out very much. Coming here was a very different experience for me. I could go out on my own terms, explore the city, and make friends outside of academic contexts. And the reason why I wanted to sort of put this out is because there is a politics of hope that is really interwoven in the kind of narratives that we are looking at. And we want to look at how this hope is maintained, negotiated, and sometimes, unfortunately, fractured as coming transforms to becoming, which is the second register that I want to talk about. So what happens once you are within the science institution, right? So Morpheus says, what an IIT cultivates beyond learning is a certain amount of conceit. It's a general sense of assholery. I apologize for the unparliamentary language, but unfortunately, or fortunately, that's the term that my respondent used, and I thought it would be best to keep it intact. And then Morpheus went on to explain, because I asked, what do you mean by assholery? Can you give me an explanation of what assholery means? And Morpheus said, we are not just learning content, we are also forming communities and identities. We are shaping who we are in the world. Part of the thing that you learn in an IIT is that there are statuses in the world, and that these statuses matter for what doors will open for you and what doors will not open for you. And that brings me back to Latour's conception of modernity, which is what science claimed to herald. And modernity claims a unique and distinct identity, one that is detached and distinguished from pre-existing identities and knowledge systems. And this IIT subculture, based on what Morpheus has been telling us, is a representative of the masculinist, cis and heteronormative culture that perpetuates in elite science institutions. And this subculture claims a similar distinctness. And we actually have previous narratives. Even Chainika Shah has written about how women in IIT were called the IIT female. So this IIT female who was masculinized and desexualized. And Chainika Shah has written about it. So there's a constant, particularly in the IIT subculture, we see a constant claim to be an elite, distinct identity, which perhaps Morpheus is calling a general sense of assholery. But there are other identities that one finds themselves building, and one of them is the idea of the scientific genius, where one is trying to constantly fit themselves. So for example, Geeta Chadha says that the construct of the scientific genius distinguishes the scientist from a human being and makes science aspirational. And in making science aspirational, it is made inaccessible. So the scientific genius is basically the construct of this crazy white-haired man, working day and night in the laboratory, unperturbed by anything and everything around him, and working only towards truth and truth alone. Um, and you see that science institutions enforce this kind of conformance to the genius identities. For example, Nick said that the workload that they have as a second year undergrad student is pretty intense. For me, I have around 7 hours of classes every day from Monday to Thursday. And then I have 4 hours on Friday. Most of my time every day is spent in the classroom. If I attend all classes, ideally all of my day should be spent there. You end up being left with no social life and no sleep. And this not being left with social life or sleep is important because this is, again, in Geeta Chadha's words, is the theatrics of brilliance. That if you are a brilliant person, if you are somebody who's trying to play God in terms of doing their science, then you do not, then there is nothing called overwork because you are this hyper-masculine hero figure, God figure who's able to work as much as they want. So if there is no overwork, then you don't need to be answerable to question of labor, to question of time and question of rest. And this theatrics of brilliance then sort of constructs this game where anybody who enters it is going to fall into this idea of overworking and being left with no social life and sleep. And Morpheus talks also about, similar theatrics of brilliance that is pumped around to, and how, when people leave the country for their PhDs, how that kind of is a narrative that's pumped around within the IIT through theatrics of brilliance. So Morpheus says, that's the narrative that was being pumped all around, that if you are good enough, you go abroad. If you're not good enough, you stay in second place. We have already been fed that we are the best in the country. So why wouldn't you go to the best universities in the world? Why would you study a PhD in India? They are bad institutions. So, and remember that this person is in an IIT, has finished an MTech. IITs are India's creme universities, most elite, heavily funded, and yet there's a constant desire to claim an even more quote unquote brilliant location, a distinct identity, and an identity that's sort of affording more and more merit on one's shoulders. Sorry, yeah. So, and finally, I think there's also objectification of queer and trans people that happens in science institutions. So for example, Salah talks about the time that they tried to start a queer trans collective on their undergrad campus, and nobody came to that collective because they were very scared of associating with a queer collective on campus. But there's a more interesting conversation that I want to show you. So D, who's queer, trans, and intersex, approached the principal for a queer cell, and D went there not as a queer person, but as an ally. And the principal's first reaction was, queer students exist in our college. Do they actually come to college to study? So of course, D responds by saying, yes, they do. There are a lot of students in the college who I know are queer and trans. The principal says such students, and the word such is in red for its reasons. Such students should come directly to the authorities rather than allies. So then the matter rests for a while, and then the principal comes back to it and tells D that there are no such students. Moreover, who will make sure that nothing anti-college and anti-government is happening through this forum? Even later, the principal says, what if a student and a teacher start dating? And when I heard of this, that was, a reminder of what Kristeva and Butler called objectification, the sense of disgust that certain bodies and certain identities are made to feel in certain social locations. And this was very curious for me because these questions were being raised because queer and trans people were trying to collectivize on these campuses. Especially when student-teacher relationships are so common in all university campuses of the country, and sexual harassment by upper caste senior male professors against junior women students goes unpunished and unnoticed for decades and years. The principal's biggest worry is that queer and trans students and teachers are going to date because queer and trans students want to collectivize in the college. which brings me through to third register, which I have called longing. Uh, I'm just going to read this and we're going to see what how longing is being sort of contextualized in this. So Morpheus, went to the US to do their PhD. And when they went there, their first PhD supervisor sort of went on a sabbatical as they joined immediately. So then they had to be transferred to a different PhD supervisor. And Morpheus says, I felt that I was kind of dowry. Like the project was going to this person and I'm carrying the dowry along, part of the retinue, if you will. That professor was kind, but I worked on fiber optics and I just didn't gel with that kind of work. In the 5th year of my PhD, I facilitated a dialogue course of sexuality. And the interesting thing was that my co-facilitators of these dialogue groups were graduate students in counseling and in education. So suddenly I was like, these are people who are doing their thesis on identity formation. So secluded were the science education and engineering departments from these humanities departments that we didn't really know what these things are possible. I was like, this is what I want to do research on. It's like you recognize something, right? So I transitioned from doing physics in an engineering department to doing education in a physics department. And over time, I've come to see many of these transitions and existing in these strange spaces within departments as also a part of queerness. Being comfortable with doing education in a physics department and constantly having to argue that there is a legitimate place for you there. It resonates and amplifies the experience of constantly having to argue with people that you have a space in this world. We want to think about, as people who are interested in identity construction, we see that there's a constant feeling of estrangement and belonging that's happening in narratives of queer and trans people in Indian science institution and in the Indian science ecosystem. And uh, my bigger critique of the earlier models of science identity is that it has failed to acknowledge the complexity of these negotiations by boxing uh, science identity into categories of competence, performance, and recognition, which are extremely meritocratic and unmeaningful, very simplistic, as far as I understand. So the fourth register is belonging, where we think about what does it mean for queer and trans people to belong to the science ecosystem. So Morpheus says that all conversations, be it curriculum, be it social life, be it home life, in all these conversations, there was a masculinist narrative. The way people would behave and interact made it very hard to really be a part of the group. I could distinctly note that my social capital in that space is rock bottom. So remember, Morpheus is an IIT, then Morpheus goes to US, physics in an engineering department, and then shifts to education in a physics department. Morpheus says if physics and engineering has all of these problems about technocracy, about militarism, about meritocracy, then how does teaching people how to do physics better help? And that leads to a certain disenchantment with traditional education research. So they shift their trajectory again from how do people learn physics to how can we help people learn physics better, to ideas like how can we get engineering and physics students to think and talk about militarism? How can we get them to see that their disciplines are doing harm? How can we get them to challenge the narrative that science is always good for society? And so again, these shifts are deeply grounded in queer identity and queer experiences. So the idea of reflexivity is very important in the prospect of queering science that we've been talking about. And these constant negotiations of science identity that we've been talking about are important for how queer and trans people conceptualize a queer science. I've almost come to the end of my presentation. So the fifth register that I call is forming, which is how are then identities formed and consolidated. And then this is a conversation from my respondent D and their research methodology teacher. D is in a biology institute. Research methodology teacher says there are only two genders. D says, and D sort of is doing this in the class, remember. No, ma'am, then you say two genders, that's erasure. There are other identities that are out there. But the teacher says, no, according to me, and that's very important that this is a science teacher who's saying this, because science claims so much. I mean, science is so anti according to me, right? I mean, it should say that no, no, according to science, according to nature, according to facts, according to objective studies, there are only two genders. Anything else is a deviant. What you're talking about is called sociology, and life sciences does not accommodate parameters like gender and sexuality. We don't do that here. And for me, that was a very interesting, a fascinating juxtaposition, really. Uh, I mean, it was as fascinating as it was infuriating, because what the research methodology teacher is doing is juxtaposing sociology beside science and saying that if science is the study of the normal and therefore the important, then sociology is the study of the deviant and therefore the unimportant. So concerns of sociology are unimportant and deviant. So I call this the construction of the deviant, that the deviant doesn't exist in science classrooms. The deviant is made, and the deviant is made in exactly these processes by saying that, oh, marginal gender and sexualities are not the concern of science. It is the concern of sociology. It is sociologists who keep talking about it. And if sociologists keep talking about it, then it must be the deviant. It must be unimportant for sciences. So it's a very complex way in which science classrooms particularly construct ideas of the deviant and ideas of abjection sort of perpetuate. And finally, the final register, as you perhaps had expected, is called transforming. So now that there are queer and trans people who have formed, consolidated their identities in science institutions, have they been, what is the kind of transformation that's happening of the institution itself? And for this, I want to use the case study of a queer trans collective in one of India's elite science institutions. This elite science institution is often called the Iyengar Institution. And you probably already know what I'm talking about. It is a bastion of Brahminism. And they have been able to form a trans collective. The trans collective started out as a temporary group during the Trans Awareness Week in 2021. Salah, who's one of the collective's founding members, was handling the queer collective's social media page and wanted to post a couple of things. And it is during this that discussion sort of snowballed into creation of a trans GNC-GNP collective. And this collective is now a permanent group and more active than the larger queer collective, which has queer people and allies. What was interesting to me when I was sort of documenting the collective is that the collective is open to trans people on other campuses. Members of the collective offer support and intervene when trans people outside the campus face a physical or mental crisis. And through the collective, trans people who are not affiliated with the institution often visit the otherwise safeguarded and gate-kept campus. And for me, this was a beautiful visualization of how the in-group, out-group boundaries of the social and the science are not as hard. And the very presence of queer and trans people on these campuses, the very fact that they are collectivizing, led to a breakdown of that boundary even further. These boundaries become porous and allow for science to become more social. Also, we find intersectional solidarities being built in this institution, which I said is an Iyengar institution. So the trans collective managed to burn the Manusmriti on campus on Christmas last year, which was wonderful since the campus is the bastion of Brahminism. Just for you to take note that the trans collective was also at the helm of raising concerns about a dysfunctional SC/ST cell on the campus. Now, this was important for me because there has been a growing body of theorizing from narratives that have primarily come out from Dalit trans people like Living Smile Vidya and Grace Banu, that gender and caste are not as distinct categories as we've been imagining them to be. So Living Smile Vidya, for example, has called transphobia as a form of Brahminism. So transphobia is sort of executed in the same way that Brahminism is, which is through untouchability and segregation. G. Semalar has written about how it is only in Dalit colonies that trans people are able to rent houses. And the fact that there's more visibility of hijras in Dalit colonies has to a certain extent normalized their presence, though they are ridiculed on an everyday basis. And Grace Banu has written very beautifully about how we have to fight not just a patriarchal society, but also our own communities. We have to fight within the queer movement, we have to fight with civil societies, and we have to fight within the feminist movement. And here we see a trans collective of people, queer and trans, in science institutions who are fighting with a different movement, which is the movement of enlightenment and the movement of science and the proclamation of this modernist distinct identity in science institutions. So I want to finish this with a very brief note on the question of identity formation, how it's linked to the idea of community formation, is that we can envision communities. And I must say, one of my respondents came up with sort of this analytic that one has to think of communities as something that can either be a big C community, an all-encompassing community where everybody is felt welcome. And then there are small C communities, which are communities that are transient, that are ethereal, that are formed and dissipated and reformed. And whether one can find a big C communities through the identities that they are constantly forming, consolidating, and negotiating in science institutions, I don't know. But it is these moments of small C community formation where the power and potential for science and science practice to be queered lies. And with that, I'd like to thank the Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures team for an early career grant that supported this study. And of course, Ayush Gupta, Bishal, Geeta Chadha, and Pushpesh Kumar at these institutions for ideas and conversations that have been fundamental to the project in its current state. I'm done, but I'm very happy to take questions and suggestions and just conversations. And I'm sorry that this was such an unequal conversation where I ended up speaking for almost an hour, but I'll make it up by letting you speak as much as you want while I'm the patient listener.
Thank you, Sayantan. Am I audible?
You are, yeah.
Okay. Before going to the discussion, I just want to announce that we just formed the queer collective at this Hyderabad campus this week, and hopefully we can take inspiration from this discussion and stay and perform some good work at this campus.
So congratulations, Ritvik, for being able to form that collective. And I'm very excited by the prospect because I visited TISS Hyderabad in 2017, the last time, and at that point of time there was no collective, and we did have some discussion about how one can organize queer trans people on the campus, and I'm really glad that you've been able to do that. Yeah,
that has finally taken form. So if there are any comments, questions, please raise them. Any of that these would like to add to the discussion, please.
Yeah, I think if I could just come in with a comment and have a question if Sayantan wants to take it up. Basically,
definitely.
it's a huge challenge. The agenda of queering science education is, of course, begun in India. It's been there. I mean, I would say, of course, the beginnings are the feminist movement, but that's, I think you're acknowledging that as well. But then going forward, queering science education would require a whole lot more. I think you are indicating that. So I just wanted you to give a few examples of what has been done. And also in your own journalism, how would you attempt this? So specific examples, and I think in the recent past there seems to be like a whole lot of issues, including, I suppose, monkeypox to some extent. So if you can talk about what queering science education would involve specifically. Also because the example of Morpheus was, it's not that he's vacated the space of science, but I don't know if he or you would think of him as being at the margins of science and getting into science education. So it's education in physics. But again, the question of querying science itself, if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to think about this question with you, Rekha. So I think I must say that that science was already a lot more queerer in the country uh, because of how closely the queer movement and the development of science is connected, right? So if you look at the late 1960s, you have the Kerala Sahitya Shastra Parishad, which is KSSP, which says science for social justice. It coins the slogan that comes up. 1975 to 1977, you have the emergency that's imposed by the Indira Gandhi government. And during that emergency, women's bodies are sort of tampered with left, right, and center. And as a result, in the 1970s, you have the women's health movement, which was fundamental to using scientific temper as something that could be taken to the masses. And then in the 90s, you have the HIV/AIDS movement, right? So in the 80s and 90s, after HIV and AIDS become a pandemic, you have a very unique relationship with science where people are both critiquing science by saying that you are sort of constructing homophobia and constructing transphobia by saying that whatever, we have small brains or some extra gene or some nonsense like that. But at the same time, there is hope from science, right? A hope that we've been terribly failed, which is a vaccine, a medicine, and something like that. So then HIV/AIDS also becomes and pandemics that were always interesting because they sort of solidify the relationship between the state, the society, and the science ecosystem. Then you've also seen that during COVID-19. We've also seen that during monkeypox. Uh, so the but the so the thing is that there is a certain queer engagement with science that's always been there. The question is how much of that transpires into a science classroom, how much of histories of science and politics of science and philosophies of science and politics, philosophies, and histories of science that have come from marginalized locations, like the feminist movement, like the queer trans movements, are we being taught in science classrooms, and how are we taught that the practice of science and the epistemology and the ontology of science are not things that are separate from how we think about ourselves, the knowledge that we produce about ourselves, and how we negotiate our lives. So I think, and which is why I believe that that it has to be a new science, right? It's a reimagination. The way science is being taught right now in classrooms and the way science is being practiced in laboratories and the field right now just does not have the ability to go beyond simplistic categorization, beyond reductionism, beyond commonsensical understandings of objectivity. It's only when a certain complexity of thought and process would be introduced in both science education and in science classrooms and in the practice of sciences when that reimagination is possible. And a little bit about how my work might be doing this. And I mean, it's always a little scary to think of my work as doing something that fundamental. But so with the lifeofscience.com, I did a series of comics, autobiographical narratives of transgender, non-conforming, and gender non-binary people in the science ecosystem. We started with Bittu Rajaraman, who was at Ashoka University. Then the second one was Grace Banu, who was a Dalit trans engineer from Tamil Nadu. Then Aksa Sheikh, who's a doctor and trans woman, associate professor at the Hamdard Institute of Medical Science and Research. And the fourth and the final one was on two women, Amrita Mukherjee and Aparna Banerjee, who were HIV/AIDS activists and now working with various NGOs, but also trans women. And in all these narratives, what I have tried to ensure is that these narratives don't become role model narratives, because the women in science movement has told us that all stories, I mean, we don't have stories of anybody other than male Brahmin white scientists, and whatever little stories of other locations trickle in to the narrative of science, these are all stories that are of heroes and superheroes. So we ensured that that's role model identity is sort of broken down. More importantly, I also sort of thought, consciously did the comics in a way that moments of their life and moments in their science are intersecting with each other, and the way they think about science and the way they think about their lives is not distinguished from each other. You see that very clearly in the comics. I'll put some links. So some of my work is that uh, some of my work is also to think about how policy and so basically legal and judicial interventions in science, so science, technology, innovation policy, the national education policy, and other policies, how some of these policy level interventions have just failed to recognize this complexity of identity altogether. The fact that science, education, and trans people have a certain relationship that has to be understood before a proper legal and judicial intervention can improve education for trans people is something that these policies completely don't reflect. And we are trying, so we're almost at the verge of finishing a policy brief that highlights some of these issues. And hopefully that should be out in another 15 days or so. And we'll see how that goes. Does that answer your question, Rekha?
Yes, it does. Which publishers put out these comics? I didn't get that.
The lifeofscience.com. I'll put a few links in the
Sure.
chat.
That'd be useful. Yeah. Thanks.
No worries.
I wanted to ask you something. As we were discussing, so I started to think about this increasing, anti-trans violence happening in the US, even in policy on trans students, and how it is, how it often quotes science to fuel their hate or transphobia. And at the same time, we have within the community discourse, like people trying to validate themselves and root themselves in science, trying to prove. And how do you understand this, opposition?
Yeah. So, this idea of trying to use science as a method of legitimizing our identities is not new, right? I mean, it's grounded in, again, a certain history. So you have the Bible that tells us that bad people make gays. We have Freud, who tells us that bad parenting makes gays. So everything bad, and then there is social constructivism that says bad environment makes gays. So in an environment where everything bad seems to be making gays, you have in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, a bunch of gay scientists who decide to show that no, being gay is natural. So what do? They start chopping up brains of gay men who died of AIDS and comparing those brains with heterosexual men who died of AIDS. And they say, okay, this part of the gay brain seems to be smaller than the heterosexual brain, and therefore that is where homosexuality is located. Somebody does genetics and says, okay, that gene is where homosexuality is located. So this is also happening in a larger context, which is trying to sanitize this idea of bad people, bad parenting, and bad environment making queer and trans people. The problem with that is that, I mean, there's nothing natural about the clothes that I wear, and there's nothing natural about my existence anymore. So we should not need to claim a natural identity to be accepted in the society. So that is how one locates this kind of work that you've been talking about, legitimizing, using science as a tool to legitimate one's identity. And this becomes very interesting, right? I mean, then people will say clownfish change their sex all the time, and some tortoise is going to be born a male if the temperature is high and female if the temperature is low. You see homosexuality in 172 species. I mean, I get it that I mean, all of it is very interesting as somebody who studies the sciences, but I am not a clownfish and I'm not a tortoise. I'm a human being. And if heterosexual people are not willing to say that um, everywhere else, so many animals are heterosexual to prove their position in society, then why do I need to say clownfishes are queer and this thing is queer and that thing is queer to legitimize my identity? I mean, that's my more political problem with the question. But one must also understand that there is some potential in science that one has to recognize, which is how science enables a certain transformation of the body that affords reimagining of the body the way one couldn't think about, let's say, a century back. So now, thanks to science and technology, I can take hormones and transform my body in bits and pieces, in parts, to make a mosaic body that is my body and is nobody else's to think about. The problem is that because science functions in such a capitalist and cis and heterosexual paradigm, that none of these really trickle down to the people who need it and the people who use it. So for something like silicon, right? I mean, if a trans woman wants silicon to sort of amplify the breasts or something, there's such a lot of stigma that's associated with it. When breast augmentation is a process that cis women do way more than trans women do. And that's not problematic. What is problematized is the fact that trans women want breasts. And why is that a worry? It's just, it is. So the thing is that I do believe that an emancipated potential of science is being completely lost because of how science functions, where science comes from, what its epistemology and ontology is, and the fact that it's refused to engage with social questions for this long. So a lot of this work is actually geared not to say that there's an inherent problem in the sciences, there is, but also to say that there's an emancipatory potential in science, which science has failed to realize because it has failed to engage with these questions. Does that answer your question, Ritvik?
Absolutely. If there are any questions from the audience.
I can't hear you, Divya Darshan. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can.
So thank you so much, Sayantan, for sharing, not just how caste and patriarchy and all of these various issues are interlinked, but also history of the movements and where we are at. My question is a little bit specific, and I'm not. I've also spoken with Aksa, and one thing she talks about is specifically in medical science and medical science research, this obsession with the binary in how medical colleges are, everything from the physical structure, infrastructure to how inclusion exclusion criteria are set while deciding on what your sample size is going to be for a particular research study. Not that going beyond the binary can contribute in sciences as well, right? And I think that's a similar question to what was already asked, but I want to sort of look at it again on how do you see breaking down the binary helping in advancing knowledge in various fields?
Okay, I mean, so
other examples, because Aksas I know of.
No. So Aksa, I mean, I don't want to make an example out of anybody, to be honest. But I'm thinking in a larger question of why queer something, because one of the aspects of queering is to imagine things, reimagine things in non-binary ways. So what I'm thinking about is how science constructs categories is through this kind of a bell curve idea, right? That there's a normal and majority of people lie in that normal, and as long as you have a phenomenological understanding of what's happening in the middle of the bell curve, the normal, you can safely leave the tails out. And that's literally what a margin means, right? You're at the margin of that curve and you're being left out. My point is that studying marginal narratives is important. Studying is because it'll lead you to knowledge that the bell curve cannot. So my sense is the way I'm trying to tell you is that I think science has lost out on so much knowledge because it has chosen to ignore narratives that are not within the binary. Because it's easy to explain in binary terms, and it works for the majority. What science is, my sense is that science might have actually lost out on fundamental narratives that are at the tail of that bell curve, that do not fit in the majority, and has perhaps sort of missed those very interesting narratives that non-binary challenges to categorization would have helped. And we have examples, right? I mean, of knowledge becoming non-binary in the sciences. So, I mean, you have the wave theory of light and the particle theory of light, and then you have wave-particle dualism. So it's not that science is intrinsically resistant to the idea of unsettling strict categorization in two categories. But when it comes to identities that are marginalized, I think there's an intrinsic resistance in science to go beyond normative understandings of the body, of desire, of sex, sexuality, gender, caste. These are not things that science is interested to engage with, which means science is losing out. I strictly believe that this desire to not engage is very, very problematic. And the second thing that happens is that by constantly creating this void of objectivity around you, and this is something that Donna Haraway and Sandra Harding have spoken about, right? That the reason why one should bring subjectivity into the study of science is recognize their subject position, their vantage point, while articulating objective facts, is because that makes your claim strongly objective. Articulating your claim more specifically with your subject position actually leads to stronger objectivity. And that's what Sandra Harding says, that this voice from nowhere objectivity, that the cell has, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This is a voice from nowhere objectivity. Or women have smaller brains than men. This voice from nowhere objectivity is weakly objective. But a voice from somewhere, a voice that is located, is strongly objective. It tells us that all science is stories, and if all science is stories, then we can choose which stories to tell. We can choose to tell stories of upliftment, of emancipation, stories that center marginalized disciplines. And that way, the task of science and the task of sociology are not very different. So I think Zygmunt Bauman, I mean, if there's somebody who's trained in sociology, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Bauman had said that the task of sociology is to defamiliarize the familiar and familiarize the unfamiliar. And that is the task of science. I strongly believe that that is also the task of science. And I think then the task of science and task of sociology will become similar when that kind of an interaction happens. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
I also kind of wanted to ask you about these NCRT guidelines that came out quite recently on the inclusion of transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming children to sensitize teachers, and how it was taken down, ironically, by on grounds of like protection of child rights. So it feels hard to believe that all this is out of transphobia. And could it also be because this document could have recognized children's right to self-determine for themselves? And
definitely,
definitely.
I mean, so self-determination has met severe resistance, because when you say I'm going to determine myself and my identity, you are delegitimizing the power of the state and the system and the structure, which is constantly trying to enforce identities. So I found the NCERT guidelines extremely interesting because the Annexure 2 of the guideline spoke about how school education in its current format can accommodate uh, pedagogy in a way that trans people are empowered. So for example, you want to teach biomolecules in class 9 to biology students, you also talk about, and you're going to anyway talk about hormones, which are proteins, then also talk about puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy, letting non-conforming and non-binary children know that there's always an option for you to play with your identity before your body commits to one. So the point is self-determination by me, by you, or by children challenges an identity that's comfortable to the state. The state, it's easy for the state, the civil society, the system, and the structure to say that you're man, you're woman, this is what you're supposed to do, go ahead and do it, live a good, happy life, don't be gay, don't be trans, and you're going to be fine. Don't be Dalit, don't be disabled. Don't be any of those things that we cannot accommodate and deal with. But when you say self-determination, you're delegitimizing this power. You indeed are. You're saying that, no, I want to sort of say who I am and what I am and where I am and how I am. And the structure doesn't like it. The structure fights back. And when the structure fights back, it's quite harsh. Well, what do we do? You fight back, and this fight continues.
If there are any more questions or comments anyone would like to share.
Hi, I would like to ask a question. Thank you so much for the talk. So in one of your slides, in one of the testimonies, I think a participant told that how we also have to fight within the movement, within the communities also. And that got me thinking that within the LGBTQ plus community, there are also certain kind of invisibilities when it comes to certain sexual and gender identities. Like, for example, in US, gays are more recognized than lesbians. And I think it's also true in Indian context as well. And when it comes to gender expression, men behaving as men having feminine expression are ridiculed more than like women in an androgynous expression. So I just want to ask you, like, in your work, have you seen such invisibilities of certain sections, or like do you have a recommendation how to navigate conversations among different identities?
Yes, I don't want to recommend anything because I feel deeply uncomfortable as one QT person from a very specific location, post caste class and ability wise, to be coming and giving recommendations. But I must tell you that I don't think these intersectional hierarchies are invisible anymore. So we know that Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, queer and trans people's bodies are constantly de-desired and undesired and ridiculed and harassed and abused within the larger LGBTQIA plus movement. We know that certain sexualities like pansexuality, bisexuality, asexuality, it does not find a place in the larger discourse in the queer and trans movement. We know that people with disability who are queer and trans face severe discrimination within the queer and trans movement, which tells us that our understanding of the movement has to really, really change. We have to be self-reflexive in the way we want to think about the movement, and give more and more sort of space for these marginal narratives to emerge. I think we have so few marginal narratives. Like, you're absolutely correct in saying that gay men are at the center of LGBTQIA plus movements for so long, despite the larger work of organizing and community building happening through queer women and transgender people. So if you look at the main political organizing that's happened through queer women in the country and transgender women and transgender men in the country, but the centers always the elite, upper caste, urban, able-bodied, neurotypical cis gay men. And I'll tell you an incident. When Section 377 was read down, a week after reading down in Hyderabad, we had a meetup, a potluck, where everybody brought some food, and apparently we were celebrating the reading down of Section 377. There was one of the big gay men activists from Hyderabad in that location who kept on, who then, I mean, after the potluck was over, sort of organized us in lines, almost felt like you were a soldier in some military school. And then he said, we'll sing. And I said, okay, what are we singing? He said, we are going to sing, We Have Overcome. So there's this song, We Shall Overcome. He said, we have overcome. So he literally made us stand at soldiers in a line and made us sing the end of the movement, as if reading down of Section 377 was what everyone was fighting for. I mean, it was one of the things that everyone was fighting for, but everyone was also fighting for equal right to education, equal right to healthcare, equitable access to public spaces, self-determination. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I can give recommendations in terms of how to navigate it, but I'm doing the same thing as you are doing, which is shining a bright light. Emily Martin calls shining a bright light on these, so that we are aware of this and can take the conscious decision of navigating and negotiating these. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm not from science background. I'm from I'm student of economics. But I hugely draw inspiration from Sayantan's talks usually, where he brings about topics which I largely think have an interdisciplinary scope to think about and I mean to to research in those directions, help in start thinking at some point. So my doubt is not something specific. I really enjoy the talk completely, but I'm not a person to ask questions from the science aspects of it. I don't have that much knowledge to ask such questions. But my doubt particularly is your talk seems to be something like you are pioneering it. I wish to know, where do you draw inspirations for like formulating your ideas, talks, and are you like do you have some people, or like, also I wish to know whether you look across the mountain. I mean, you talk about sociology, but I never seen you talk anything particular about other social sciences. I wish to know social
Sorry,
science. So,
I lost the last part. You said that I talk only about sociology, not about other social sciences, and then you were finishing that sentence, and I could. Yeah.
oh, I particularly haven't listened to you speaking about other social sciences, like in political science or like economics, and that sense.
Yeah,
There are I mean, there are huge moments
definitely.
happening in those disciplines also.
Right.
And I mean, as you were just mentioning that, I mean, gay men are dominant in carrying out certain movements, but what I could understand from economics at least is that feminist movements, feminist economics movements were the starting points of curing economics, at least in the beginning stage. And now also the dominating phases are women who takes up this cause in mostly. Yeah, but there are other people also. I don't have a particular, I mean, there is very less literature in economics also. Sorry to take all the things to the economics part, but like, yeah, this is my question, whether you like feel like a pioneer in what you're doing, or like, do you draw inspiration from others, or like how cautious you are when you are drawing inspiration from others? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to answer that part later, but let me try to address uh, the rest of the part first, which is that I mean, I talk about sociology simply because in my interviews, it appears that scientists think of sociology as something that's, I don't know, a hellkeeper's job. They think what sociologists do is essentially study weird people, weird places, weird communities, and weird phenomena. And I find that very interesting. I find the word weird very interesting because that was the literal meaning of the term queer. And I think sociology in its current state right now has an immense potential of driving queer theory and queer consciousness and queer thought. So, and I am very, very uneducated about other disciplines like anthropology, political science, economics, and I prefer not to talk about them unless I have some understanding of what is happening there. Part of it is also that uh, some people who have in recent times been in touch with are primarily trained as sociologists, and perhaps that's why some of my critical consciousness is very sociological in nature. Now coming to the question of pioneering or not, so I think that a large part of my work is just being a scribe. I want to compile stories and I want to use every opportunity that I have to put those stories out. Now, and these are not efforts that are completely new. These are efforts that are grounded in a certain feminist consciousness. These are grounded in anti-caste consciousness. These are grounded in disability rights consciousness. So the queer movement, for example, will take its birth from feminist consciousnesses. It will also take its birth from anti-caste consciousness. So if you think about marriage, kinship as questions that are important to the queer community, then you'll know that question of marriage and kinship are so fundamental to the anti-caste movement. We have the entire idea of marriage being and kinship, traditional ideas of marriage and kinship being challenged because of the work that's not happened in either feminist or queer movement, but because of the work that's happened in anti-caste movements. So similarly, questions of body, access, desire, and desirability are questions that the disability rights movement and people with disabilities have raised for a very long time. So I think, and I think this is a work that my student Ria is doing at Kriya University, is sort of looking at the histories of these three broad trajectories of movements, the feminist movements, anti-caste movements, and disability rights movement, and thinking about what queer and trans movements sort of stand on the shoulders of. So what I'm trying to say is that no, I am not a pioneer of any of this thought. I don't consider myself one. I'm immensely grateful to every respondent who's put immense faith and trust in sharing their stories. These are there are deep personal stories that they have put faith on me and shared with me. And I'm immensely grateful to several people who've shared knowledge. So I don't have any training in education research or sociology research. I was trained as a natural scientist all my life. And yet there are people like Pushpesh Kumar and Ayush Gupta and Geeta Chattha, Anu, who's here, and so many more people, Jainika Shah, who've spent days and days educating me in the kind of work that they do and in the kind of future that my work holds. So I'm immensely grateful to a larger community and these small C communities that I was talking about where I belong, and I'm really, really grateful to them. I think Saloni has a hand up.
Yeah, hello, sir. Actually, my camera is off, so I think I hope that you would not mind. I have a very poor internet connection.
No worries, absolutely.
So the questions also that people are asking are very informative, not only your talk, but I have a doubt here. Like somebody was talking about binaries that, I mean, usually what happens is that generally if it's a male or female binary, then one group or it tends to dominate the other. I mean, if it's male and female, then the man is dominating, and then feminist discourses also came up with their issues within the LGBT also. I mean, everybody, for most of the time, they have talked about lesbian and gay studies, but then the trans issues were also there. But sir, within the trans also, I found this binary, like people are talking about trans women. There are many writers who are trans women, but I have heard heard very less about trans men. Even within the cross dressers, people are, I I mean, they dress up as women. But if we talk about, there are drag queens. I've seen very less drag kings, at least in the Indian scene. Maybe it's happening over in the West. So I think within the trans also, I mean, this binary thing is something which you cannot like do away with. I mean, the deeper we go into it, we will find binaries, even if it's complex or even so. So, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you that trans men are terribly underrepresented in the current state of the queer movement. Um, I think in terms of trans king, Hyderabad, by the way, is one of the places where I think there are more trans king that I know than any other place in the country. Patruni Chidananda Shastri has sort of done a great work of consolidating several people who come from different drag locations and bring them on the same stage. But the point is that if you dig deeper, you find binary. I think that I find a little problematic because my sense is that it should be right opposite. I mean, if you start digging deeper and you start a deeper inquiry into the question of identity, the question of gender identity, sexual identity, you will come up with general insights, I think, which are, profound general insights like, gender is performative, or which will perhaps challenge the binary. I mean, my sense is, as far as I've read, that I don't think that just because we articulate our identities in terms that can look like a binary, so trans man, trans woman, uh, doesn't mean that we think of our identities as binaries. I'm pretty sure because there are several ethnographic work which is telling us that trans identities constantly unsettle binaries. So I think Don Kulik, an anthropologist who did the ethnography of travestis in Brazil, there you see that travestis are, trans feminine community who will constantly keep on articulating themselves as, I'm like a woman, but not a woman, like a woman. And similarly, so they modify their bodies similarly. And there's a very, very thorough ethnography from Don Kulik that's there. But they actually challenge the strict category of a woman completely by constantly saying, I'm not a woman, I'm like a woman. I'm not a woman, but I'm like a woman. So it's a phenomenological question of, you have to understand what is it that being like a woman means. Then similarly, if you look at hijras, they have similar articulations. If you look at kotis, and if you ask them, what does being a koti mean? I think Pushpesh Kumar has said that they will say, you need to have a certain kotiness to be koti. And that's the question of qualia, that's the question of a qualitative nature of being a koti. That's not falling within the question of masculine, feminine, man, woman. It's creating new phenomena by saying that there is kotiness, there is hijrapan. So they'll say koti ka kotpan and hijra ka hijrapan. And these are identities that are not articulated in terms of binaries. I think it is our sort of dominant and normative idea that we articulate, we see binaries and we articulate binaries so frequently, while on digging deeper through questions of identity, I think you are able to unsettle binaries.
Okay, thank you, sir.
If there are no,
if there's some time, I would like to ask a question.
sure.
So I'm a student of women's studies, and one of the topics we are studying right now is intersectionalities, and we talk about, as you said, we talk about caste, we talk about religion, and all of other intersectionalities. So one of the main points in your presentation I saw was that the current and even the previous scientific research or information that we have right now is extremely patriarchal, is extremely homophobic, transphobic, and Brahmanical. So focusing on the Brahmanical point, when we say Brahmanical, we are, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are focusing more on the Hindu ideals of what is the norm, right? So,
yeah, I mean, is there a follow-up question to that?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, how have other religions also, made an impact on this on this trend that we have in scientific research or even social research for that matter, where we are restricting, we are not opening up to a world of possibilities that could be there, and we're just focusing on not just Hindu but any other religion, how it has contributed to that.
Yeah, so my sense is that when we say Brahminism is no longer restricted by religion, I think Brahminism and casteism is something that's percolated public consciousness and thought. So, and if that is true, then I don't think it's as that science is Brahminical is as much a question of science being Hindu, although it can be, but the question of how science happens. So think about science education. It happens in the transmission model of education that I'm sure all of you are aware of, but there is one Brahmin science teacher who's going to come and sit in the center of the classroom. Everybody's sort of around that fellow, and knowledge is being transmitted from one direction to the other without any critical question. That is how Vedic Gurukuls used to run. So science education is Brahminical in its very infrastructure, it's very set up. Science practice is Brahminical given the immense amount of power the supervisor holds over his or her students, their students. So I think the question of Brahminism and the question of caste is no longer something that is limited by Hinduism, but something that has just seeped into public consciousness. But if you look at scientific knowledge itself, I think we have a lot of examples of science knowledge that's been generated from marginalized locations, and they're not spoken about in science classrooms because they don't fit the general understanding of the scientific method, the general understanding of reductionism and objectivity. But if you look at I think Claude Alvarez and Ashish Nandi, all these people have written about local knowledge systems and the kind of knowledge that these systems have produced. So if you look at Irula and Irula tribes, you see that some of these Irula tribes who are snake charmer communities, they would have an assortment of, they also understand some kind of surgical knowledge. They have some kind of medicinal knowledge. They have they have knowledge about the plants and medicinal plants in their location, all of which would be sort of how also scientific knowledge should look like. But our scientific knowledge is sort of very compartmentalized. So surgeon knows only surgery, and our pharmacist knows only pharmacy. So the sense is that there's a lot of alternative knowledge that's already existing, which science is very resistant to incorporate because it doesn't fit its general framework of reductionism, objectivity, etc. But Brahminism, when one says, I think it's more of a social structure rather than something that's confined by the boundary of religion. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
If there are no more questions or comments, we can conclude today's discussion. I want to thank Sayantan for taking time out of their day and sharing their work with us. And I'm sure everyone leaves this meeting with, with a lot of questions. It was very thought-provoking and ideas. And yeah, I hope this was I'm sure this was a fruitful discussion. And I want to thank all the attendees, members of the Queer Club for joining offline and online. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. Thank you, Sayantan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks. Bye, Anu, and bye, Rekha. And thank you, Ritwik, for facilitating this discussion.